47 million people, 3 countries as a home base, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and millions more scattered across Brazil, Cuba, the United States, and the United Kingdom. That is the scale of the group this story is about before a single word of theory gets introduced. And here is the second number, sitting right next to the first. This population has been sequenced, resampled, and cross-referenced more than almost any other named ethnic group on the planet. In 2007, when the International HapMap project needed a reference population from sub-Saharan Africa, it picked the Yoruba of Ibadan, Nigeria, a cohort now abbreviated in genetics papers simply as YRI. That sample didn't disappear into an archive. It became a foundation stone. By the time the 1000 Genomes Project published its final phase, YRI genomes were folded into a dataset of 2,504 individuals from 26 populations worldwide, cataloging more than 88 million genetic variants used as the baseline against which human genetic variation everywhere else gets measured. So the Yoruba are not an obscure population waiting to be discovered. They are, in a very literal sense, one of the most studied human groups in the history of genomics. Which makes the next part strange. A group this heavily sequenced, this thoroughly documented, still carries genetic mysteries that were only worked out, piece by piece, within the last few years. How does one named ethnic group, with one language and one origin story, end up holding this much unresolved genetic history inside it? And what does 2 decades of sequencing actually say about where that history comes from? Here's what common sense would predict. Yoruba is one language. Ile-Ife is one origin city, tied to one founding figure, Oduduwa, an oral tradition passed down through royal lineages for centuries. One name, one language, one founding myth. The intuitive assumption is that this adds up to one relatively uniform genetic population, a single extended bloodline with some regional variation at the edges. That is the expectation. It is not what 2 decades of DNA sampling shows. In 2019, a mitochondrial DNA survey analyzed the control region, a section of DNA passed down the maternal line, used because it mutates fast enough to distinguish closely related lineages, in 71 Yoruba individuals. The result, 65 unique haplotypes, distinct maternal genetic signatures, out of just 71 people sampled. That works out to a haplotype diversity score of 0.9976, on a scale where 1.0 represents maximum possible diversity. 92% of the sample carried a maternal lineage essentially unique to them. That is not the genetic signature of a single tight-knit bloodline. That is closer to the genetic signature of an entire region's worth of history compressed into one ethnic label. Zoom out and the pattern gets bigger, not smaller. Africa as a continent holds more human genetic diversity than the rest of the world's populations combined. A fact rooted in the sheer amount of time modern humans have existed there, accumulating variation, compared to the smaller founder groups that migrated out roughly 60,000 plus years ago and colonized everywhere else. The Yoruba data isn't an anomaly against that backdrop. It's a local, up-close confirmation of it. The label Yoruba describes a shared language and shared political history. It was never going to describe a single genetic lineage, but it took direct sequencing, at this level of resolution, to show exactly how far from uniform the underlying biology actually is. The clearest demonstration of that came from a study published in February 2020, in the journal Science Advances, led by UCLA geneticists Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman. Their method, compare the genomes of 405 West Africans, the majority either Yoruba or Mende, against reference genomes from a Neanderthal fossil roughly 44,000 years old, and a Denisovan fossil dated to at least 51,000 years old. The goal was to look for genetic leftovers, fragments of DNA that didn't match modern human ancestry patterns and didn't match Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry either. They found them. Yoruba and Mende genomes carry somewhere between 2 and 19% of their genetic material from a source that is neither human, Neanderthal, nor Denisovan, an archaic hominin lineage with no name, no classification, and critically, no known fossil. Not one bone, not one tooth. The researchers estimate for when this mystery lineage split off from the shared ancestor of humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, somewhere between 360,000 and 1.02 million years ago. The interbreeding event itself, the actual mixing with ancestors of modern West Africans, is estimated to have started around 124,000 years ago, or possibly later. No fossil, no bones. Nothing physical at all, just a signature, sitting quietly inside the DNA of millions of living people, that had gone completely undetected until a comparative genomic analysis pulled it out. Skoglund and other geneticists who reviewed the findings called it a compelling case for a real, distinct archaic population, even without any physical remains to point to. This is, as of right now, the strongest and most specific answer available to the question the cold open asked. The Yoruba carry this much internal genetic depth because part of their ancestry runs through an entirely separate branch of the human family tree, one science can prove existed but has never actually seen. That finding sits underneath everything else. But it's not the only strand worth pulling. Start with the oldest claim, Ile-Ife, and the figure of Oduduwa. Yoruba oral history treats Ile-Ife as the cradle, the city where Oduduwa descended and founded the first kingship, the point of origin for dozens of Yoruba royal lineages that trace their legitimacy back to it. Archaeological work at Ile-Ife has radiocarbon dated a classical urban period there to centuries before sustained European contact began, a sophisticated walled city with an established monarchy, corroborating that something politically and culturally significant was happening at that location, long before outside written records took notice. What genetics cannot yet do is confirm a single founding lineage matching the one ancestor version of the story. The archaeology supports an old, real, urbanized society at Ile-Ife. The genome data supports a population with deep, branching diversity, not a bottleneck traceable to one man. Oral tradition and genetic evidence aren't contradicting each other so much as answering two different questions, one about political and cultural origin, the other about biological ancestry, and they don't automatically converge on the same story. Then there's the Oyo Empire, which took Yoruba political and demographic reach and stretched it. At its height, Oyo's influence extended across a wide swath of what is now southwestern Nigeria and into neighboring Benin, spreading Yoruba-speaking populations, administrative structures, and trade networks across a much larger territory than Ile-Ife's founding-era footprint. That expansion left a genetic footprint, too. It's part of why Yoruba today isn't confined to one region, but spans multiple modern states and even crosses national borders into Benin and Togo. The empire's reach is one of the reasons a single ethnic label ended up covering so much geographic and genetic ground in the first place. Then there's Igbo-Ora, a town, not an empire, but one carrying its own extraordinary number. Multiple studies dating back to hospital records from the 1980s and continuing through more recent surveys have clocked the dizygotic twinning rate there at somewhere between 45 and 53 per 1,000 births. The global average sits around 12 per 1,000. Igbo-Ora isn't twice the global rate. It's not 3 times. It's closer to 4 times the global average, concentrated in one Yoruba-speaking community south of Ibadan. Local explanations point to diet, a dish called ilasa, made from boiled okra leaves. But researchers investigating the pattern point instead toward genetic predisposition, amplified by community endogamy, a tendency, historically, not to marry outside the immediate Yoruba subcommunity, which would concentrate whatever genetic factors drive dizygotic twinning rather than diluting them across a wider population. Then there's the HapMap and 1,000 genomes role, a case that isn't about ancient history at all, but about how the Yoruba became, almost by administrative accident, the default stand-in for African genetic diversity in research conducted everywhere else in the world. Because YRI was one of the original HapMap reference populations, and later one of the anchor populations in the 1,000 Genomes Project's 2,504 genome dataset, Yoruba genetic data has been used as a baseline in disease studies, ancestry testing algorithms, and population genetics research far outside West Africa, often standing in as the African reference in analyses that have nothing directly to do with Yoruba history at all. And then there's the branch that crossed an ocean. Following the transatlantic slave trade, Yoruba-speaking people were forcibly transported in significant numbers to Brazil, particularly the Bahia region, and to Cuba, where distinct religious traditions grew directly out of Yoruba spiritual practice. Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, both preserving language fragments, deity names, and ritual structures traceable back to West African origins. Roughly 5 centuries after that separation began, modern ancestry testing datasets are now being used to try to trace Brazilian and Cuban descendants back toward specific West African source populations, an ongoing, incomplete process of reconnecting diaspora genetic and cultural lineages to the region they were taken from. 2 separate mechanisms are doing the work behind all of this, and they operate on very different timescales. The deep, ancient signal, the 2 to 19% archaic ancestry, comes from introgression, interbreeding, tens of thousands of years ago. between ancestors of modern West Africans and a now extinct hominin lineage that had already been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years. Think of it like a distant branch of a family tree that split off long before anyone alive today was born, then married back into the main family generations later, leaving a genetic trace of a relative nobody has a photograph of and nobody can name. The sharper, localized pattern, Igbo-Ora's twinning rate, works through a completely different and much faster mechanism: endogamy, marrying within a relatively small, closed community over successive generations. A closed gene pool behaves something like a photocopier making copies of copies. Whatever trait sits on the original page, in this case, whatever genetic factor increases the odds of releasing 2 eggs instead of 1, shows up disproportionately in every copy that follows, simply because the pool of originals being copied from stays small and self-contained, rather than mixing broadly with outside populations. One of these mechanisms took hundreds of thousands of years and left a trace with no known origin. The other took generations, and its origin is sitting inside a town of roughly 72,000 people, waiting to be pinned down at the gene level, which leaves the harder questions sitting exactly where the research leaves them: open. West Africa's tropical climate breaks down ancient DNA far faster than the cold, dry conditions that have preserved usable ancient genomes in places like Northern Europe or Siberia, which means almost everything described here comes from present-day genomes, not ancient ones pulled directly from the ground. So where, if anywhere, does a fossil of that archaic ghost population ever turn up? And does one exist to find? Will ancient DNA recovery techniques ever advance far enough to pull usable genetic material out of Elif's classical period burials, closing the gap between the oral history and the biology? Can researchers isolate the specific gene or genes behind Igbo-Ora's twinning rate, rather than just documenting the rate itself? And as ancestry testing technology keeps improving, how precisely will it ever be able to trace a specific descendant in Bahia or Havana back to a specific pre-colonial Yoruba subpopulation across 5 centuries and an ocean that separated them?